Hi everyone, welcome to the Communication and Conflict YouTube channel promoting mindful communication and growth through conflict. So one of the ways in which there can be more mindful communication and growth through conflict is through the process of mediation. And I've been a mediator for 23 years. And I thought today what I'd do would be probably will be two or three videos, I would imagine, about mediation, why mediation is used, and how it can help to resolve conflict in many different areas as an alternative way of trying to deal with a difficult situation. So personally, I've provided mediation in many different types of disputes, such as neighbour disputes, workplace disputes, special educational needs disagreements where parents are unhappy with the provision of support for their children who have special educational needs, university student complaints, NHS complaints, National Health Service, where patients may be unhappy with for example, their relationship with their doctor or their dentist, or even sometimes with the receptionist in the surgery. There can be complaints over that breakdown in relationship. Mediation can be used in homelessness issues, for group disputes, disability discrimination, if I can say it properly. All sorts of areas in which mediation can be a helpful process for helping people to resolve a difficulty that they're experiencing. But I think as a mediator, what I sometimes find is that there's a misconception about what it is. And obviously it's my job to try to help people to understand it better. But sometimes I think the way it's even portrayed outside of the mediation process itself is not always accurate and not always helpful. And it doesn't outline the clear distinctions or the clear help that it can provide to people in ways that things like a grievance procedure or a court process or a tribunal or some kind of hearing, which is obviously what we call a more adversarial process, just can't provide. And often mediation provides an outcome which is more satisfactory for everybody involved in the situation, whereas generally adversarial processes don't provide an outcome which sometimes anybody's happy with. Even if the person wins the case, they may not be happy with the outcome. So what I want to try to do today is outline what what mediation is and how it does help people to resolve their conflicts in whatever context that might arise. So today I think what I want to do is talk about mediation in general as a process to try to explain more about what it's for, how it works, what the thinking is behind it. And then another video will be about the mediator themselves, and so what they do, what they don't do, what their role is, how it differs to the role of a third party in some other contexts in which a complaint or a difficulty might be brought to a meeting, such as like a judge or an arbitrator or somebody like that. And then I think in the third video, what I'll do is I'll look at the meeting itself, the meetings that can happen with mediation. So the different structures to a meeting that can occur or which do occur. And try to show how they're designed to help there to be a progressive movement towards resolution of the difficulty that's being experienced by the people involved. Obviously, what I'll be speaking about is the approach to mediation that I use. There is no one approach to mediation, but I think there are some very common underlying philosophies to mediation, which most people who are involved in mediation would share. I say most because it's not all, and there are a vast range of differences in how mediation is understood and practiced. But what I'm going to do is explain what the processes that I use when providing mediation, which comes very much from what I would call a community mediation background. There are other approaches which perhaps have more of an influence from the legal field. But I hope not too contentiously, I might try to show how I think those approaches aren't as effective in helping people to resolve their disputes, because there are certain aspects to those approaches which contradict the underlying kind of thinking of what mediation can offer. But as I acknowledge, that can be contentious for some people to hear, but great. I hope if that's the case, then we can have a discussion in the comments box, or even a debate online. I'm quite happy to do that. We can have a video debate about it perhaps. So as I say, there's probably going to be 3 videos. Today's will be more about mediation in general. The next one will be about the mediator and what they do and what they don't do and what their role is. And then the third meeting will be about, third video, my apologies, will be about the meetings themselves, the interactions that the mediator has with the participants in the process, and what happens in those meetings. So yeah, that's the basis of what we're going to be looking at. And so I'll begin that now. So why do we distinguish between an adversarial process and mediation? In an adversarial process, the aim is that there's someone who's going to win the process and somebody who's going to lose it. And that's going to be decided by one or more other people who are not involved in the situation, that one person is right and the other person is wrong. So in some contexts, that's an entirely appropriate situation. So it may be that someone's assaulted in the street or something, or somebody is burgled. And we have laws that say that in that situation, the person who assaults the other person is wrong and is a criminal, and the person in the other situation, somebody who's burgled someone, they're wrong because they've broken the law. So there's a very clear need for adversarial processes in that situation. And evidence is gathered to prove that the person has done what they've done, if they have. And if that's proven, then obviously they're punished and the process goes ahead. And that's an appropriate use of an adversarial process. That's what we have adversarial processes for. But there are a lot of situations where an adversarial process is really inappropriate. And even though it's possible to pursue an adversarial process, they often lead to very unsatisfactory outcomes for people. And that particularly applies in situations like disputes at work, where often, even though one person might feel that the other person is being particularly bad towards them, it's very unlikely in certain situations, or in most situations, that it can be proven that they've done something wrong and the other person is only a victim. It's quite often the case that both sides of the situation have done something or not done something, which means that actually it's more that there's a relationship breakdown. And this is true even in situations where people feel that they're being bullied. It's very commonly the case that mediation can help resolve situations where there's an allegation of bullying. And I'll come a little bit more into why that's possible and why that is the case, because a lot of people who feel bullied at work will feel that they have a reason to expect that someone is proven to be a bully, and that they have been the victim of that behaviour. Unfortunately, it very, very rarely turns out that it's possible to prove that, which is why another reason why mediation is particularly useful in those situations. But another consequence of, or the assumption of, an adversarial process is that, as I say, there's a winner and a loser. Therefore, there's someone who's good and someone who's bad. And there's somebody who's right and somebody who's wrong. And in many, many human interactions, it's very hard to actually have that clear distinction, unless, as I said earlier, a law has been broken, which we've already established means that that person is in the wrong, and it's clearly defined by convention, by law. In many other situations, there are not laws that apply to things. And so that's true in situations like where people have a complaint. Sometimes a complaint can be upheld because someone has done something that's inappropriate, but in a lot of situations it's just a different perception of something that's happened. So for example, in complaints made by patients about doctors and dentists, it might be that the doctor feels they're doing their job properly, but for whatever reason the patient doesn't feel that they were treated with respect, or that they weren't considered in decisions that were made about them. And while it's probably unlikely that you'd find that the doctor has actually acted negligently or in a way which is unprofessional, it's quite possible they could have been more considerate in how they communicated with their patient about that. And you can transfer that to many other contexts, like neighbour disputes. It may be that someone plays their music very loudly and the other person is affected by it, but it's very unlikely there's going to be some kind of legal penalty against the person who's playing their music very loudly. It's more that the other person would have liked to have been considered, or sometimes it's the case that the other person goes around and bangs on the door and is abusive to the person who's playing their music loud, in which case again we've got a kind of a two-sided situation where no one person is right, but at the same time neither person is completely wrong. And in those situations, mediation is a great opportunity to try to recreate a better relationship in the future. And that's often what it can lead to. In workplace disputes as well, you'll get situations where someone's unhappy with somebody else's behaviour towards them, maybe a manager towards an employee, and they may not like the way that they speak to them when they've done something wrong, or even when they're just telling them to do something. They may not like the way that the person speaks towards them. But again, there may not be anything that can be proven that the person has done wrong. It's just perhaps an inconsiderate or the person doesn't understand how they're coming across in the way that they speak to them. And these kinds of things can go to grievance procedures or through complaints processes. And because it's so hard to prove that anything has been actually done wrong, it's a very subjective situation. It means it's very unlikely to get anywhere through an adversarial grievance procedure or a complaints procedure. And so it can leave everybody very frustrated. But the point is, that's where mediation can be helpful, because what mediation's doing is trying to help people to, in a sense, get back on track with each other, to understand each other's point of view. It doesn't really say they have to accept what the person's done, but it gives them an opportunity to explain why they're unhappy about it, why they found it to be inconsiderate or disrespectful or intimidating or bullying even in many cases. And so that's the beauty of what mediation provides, is this opportunity where instead of it being about proving that the person's wrong and bad, and actually often not really getting anywhere with that, it's about still being able to say what they're unhappy about, but not with the aim of trying to prove it. The other side to that is, if someone's trying to prove that you have done something wrong, the chances are all you're going to do is be defensive about it. You're not going to want to listen, because you're going to be feeling, if it's through an adversarial process, that you've got to justify everything you did. You've got to defend against everything you did. But in a non-adversarial process where that's not the purpose, where there won't be someone listening who's going to say, yep, you're wrong and you're right, which is not the role that the mediator takes. When that's not present in the meeting, it means people feel a lot safer to discuss more openly what it is that they're unhappy about from both sides, and then be able to create a better way forward in the situation. So another distinction that you can make about an adversarial process and a non-adversarial process like mediation is that an adversarial process is what's called past focused. So all you're looking at is what happened in the past. Is it sufficient proof to say that the other person is wrong? Whereas what mediation's focused on is acknowledging what's happened in the past. So it's not as if you don't talk about it, but you acknowledge that it's happened and say, okay, this didn't work, so what can be done in the future that will work? So it's using the kind of the broken relationship and picking up the pieces and putting them back together to create a different relationship that does work in the future. So mediation is a future focused process, whereas adversarial processes are past focused. And the discussion about what's happened in the past serves a different purpose in mediation. It's not about proof or truth or lies. It's about, this didn't work, so what can we do differently in the future that does work? And another thing alongside that is that it doesn't mean to say that you've got to be kind of friends with the person. In a professional relationship, it's not about whether you're friends or not, it's about whether the relationship works or not. But also even with a neighbour, it doesn't say you've got to be friends with your neighbour, but if you want to live alongside with them, then it's better to find a way of doing so than to spend your time trying to involve the council to prove that the person has done something wrong. And neighbour disputes are classic examples of where it just doesn't work. People can spend tens or even hundreds of thousands of pounds fighting with their neighbour over things like hedge disputes or trees or parking or something, and get nowhere with it and end up in debt and everything. And yet the opportunity is there for them to simply create a different relationship and a different understanding and to work together with each other to create a better way forward. But quite often it goes down a legal route and actually doesn't end up with anybody being satisfied. Even if someone wins a case, there's usually so much damage to the relationship with the neighbour or the costs involved, and the sense of kind of difficulty living in the environment that actually doesn't lead to a good outcome for anybody. And mediation definitely is a process through which that can be more effectively responded to. In workplace disputes as well, where an adversarial process is used, it's very commonly the case that the relationship just completely breaks down as a consequence, whether there's a clear outcome to the grievance procedure or not, which is actually quite a common thing to happen. And while I don't have the statistics to hand, my understanding is that in almost all situations where a grievance procedure has gone ahead in a workplace, one or both of the people involved will have left that workplace within a year of it happening because of the destruction to the relationship, to the team, to the working environment that occurs as a consequence. And yet through mediation, instead of it being that there's a winner and a loser, someone whose grievance is found to be upheld, or as I say, quite often it's not found to be upheld, and so the person who brings it feels very dissatisfied. Through mediation, very often it's possible for people to actually re-establish a working relationship, but on a different basis, with an understanding of what it is that's happened between themselves that hasn't worked. And commonly, that's the case that mediation can provide that opportunity. And so, the cost aspects of that are almost unquestionable in terms of it being a benefit to use mediation, and yet it's actually very rarely used in the workplace, even though it does provide that opportunity. And sometimes that's because there's such a kind of an assumption that the only route through such things is to use an adversarial process. But certainly where mediation is used effectively, or provided effectively, that working relationships can be re-established, and that actually that then leads to a more resilient workplace, a more resilient work team, and one that can see that it can come through conflicts, rather than it mean that everything has to break apart and everybody be very upset and affected by it. So in workplaces as well, the use of mediation rather than an adversarial process can be very effective, and nothing like as destructive as the use of adversarial processes. So why is it that mediation is able to be such a constructive process for people to use in order to resolve their disputes in a way that's very different to adversarial processes, which are more likely to lead to certainly a destruction of the relationship between people in many, many cases. So one of the things about it is that if people come to a joint meeting, they're turning up with the intention of trying to resolve. In the approach that I take, I ask both people or all people present to confirm that in each other's presence at the start of the meeting, so that they are clear that they're there with a particular intention of trying to resolve things. If they can't confirm that, then I wouldn't go ahead with the meeting, because there's no point us all turning up if there's not a shared intention to try to resolve things. In the approach that I take, and I'll tell you more about this in the other two videos, but very briefly, I just want to kind of get across why it's an environment that helps things to be resolved. There are a couple of ground rules which actually, when sometimes people hear, when I meet them separately at first about these ground rules, it helps them to feel safe enough to turn up to the meeting. And one is that people are asked not to interrupt one another during the meeting, so there is a chance for people to genuinely listen to each other and not shout over each other. And people are asked not to use abusive or offensive language or behaviour, simply because calling someone an abusive name doesn't help anything towards their stated intention of trying to resolve things. So there's a contradiction going on if they're going to abuse each other, but at the same time saying they're trying to resolve things. So those are a couple of ground rules which mean a lot of people who don't previously feel safe enough to turn up to a meeting do feel clear that actually it is going to serve a constructive purpose. That it's not just going to be a kind of a continuous kind of slanging match in the meeting, that actually the whole point of it is nothing other than to create a better way forward in the future. And so that's why, one of the reasons why it means that actually the sole purpose of what people are there for is to create a better way forward. One of the things that can sometimes happen in some approaches to mediation is there's this idea that people have got to create an agreement, whatever that means. And unfortunately, that can be a kind of a ball and chain on people, because we don't all have to agree on things in order to be able to resolve something. People may just simply understand each other better. And so the requirement to create an agreement is more coming from the legal context that I've mentioned before, where there needs to be something down on paper. And that really doesn't have to be done in mediation. If people have created something that works for them simply through talking to each other, and finding out that they can talk to each other effectively in a given environment, then often that's enough for them to feel safe enough to go forward in their situation in the future. So from my point of view as a mediator, I'm not there to tell people what they should create as an outcome. So if they don't come to agreement, that's fine, because often people don't need agreement in order to work forward in their situation. If you think about anybody you have a relationship with, and a good relationship with, you don't have to have everything written down in writing before you go forward with anything you decide together. So there's no real reason why we should expect people to create that in the mediation. The only thing that matters is what they feel is right for them. Sometimes it is a written agreement if that's what they feel is right for them. Often it's not. To be honest, in my own experience, it's probably 1 in 4 cases where people actually genuinely want anything written down. Quite often they just want to be able to re-establish their relationship and go on with things. And that's true in complaints work, it's true in patient-doctor relationships, it's true in workplace relationships, it's true in neighbour disputes. In many, many situations, it's whatever the people themselves want to create, not what I think they should create. And that again is one of the reasons why it's constructive. Is it's very flexible in its potential outcomes in situations. Another thing that some approaches to mediation insist upon, which again is for me can only be coming from a legal context, is a requirement on participants to guarantee their confidentiality about what they talk about in the meeting. I guarantee my confidentiality as the impartial mediator so that I'm providing a without prejudice process But whether the participants want to keep things confidential is up to them, because they may have good reason to share things that have come out of the meeting with others beyond it, so that it helps them to carry forward their newly created way forward. So to think that they're not allowed to talk about it when they go outside the meeting, in many contexts, may not be what they want. In some, they do. They want a very discreet, confidential meeting just because they don't want other people to know that they've had a problem. And that's fine. That's for them to decide upon. But it's not. It shouldn't need to be a requirement on them before they go into the meeting. The only guarantee of confidentiality comes from me, that I don't share what they're speaking about with anybody else. But why would I anyway? I'm nothing to do with their situation beyond my role as a mediator. So there's various things that help there to be a very safe, constructive space for people to create something new, which is obviously very different to what they would experience if they went into an adversarial process, where it's very public. Often the outcomes are shared widely. Somebody else is deciding for them what they must do as a consequence. And so the power is taken away from them to create their own outcomes. And the whole point about mediation is the power is with the people involved to create their own way forward. And while a lot of people might be cynical about whether somebody else they're in dispute with would turn up to do that, what they're often overlooking is that their perception of the other person is very likely the same perception the other person has of them, and that they both actually would prefer there to be a better way forward. It's just very hard to acknowledge that or admit that when you're involved in an adversarial situation, because for some people that kind of sounds like a sign of weakness, but actually it's a sign of strength, that people are willing to sit down with each other and create something new together. And that is one of the kind of major powers of what mediation brings as a process for people to use when they have an unresolved conflict. So hopefully that gives a bit of an overview of why mediation can be very useful, very powerful, very effective in helping people to resolve their difficult situations, whether it's a neighbour dispute or a workplace dispute or a complaint of some kind, or even group disputes. I didn't speak much about them, but in group disputes quite often mediation can be very effective as well. So I'll bring it to an end there, because what I'll do is I'll go into a little bit more detail about what specifically the mediator does in the next video. What the mediator does that helps that process to be creative and supportive, and also importantly what they don't do, which means it's a very marked difference to the role of the third person in an adversarial dispute, where that person is going to be giving a view and making a judgment, etc., which as a mediator I don't do. And I'll say a lot more about that in the next video. And then in the third video, as I say, I'll talk about the actual way in which the meetings themselves are structured to try to enable there to be a progression towards supporting people in resolving their situations. So it's designed to be carried through in a particular way which ensures that people get a chance to be heard, to be able to clarify what it is they want, and then to go on and create that together. And how my role as the mediator is ultimately, again I'll say a bit more, but my role ultimately is to become invisible in the meeting, so that it is the people themselves that create the way forward. I don't literally become invisible. I don't wear a invisibility cloak and disappear, of course, but my intervention becomes less and less and less as much as possible, so that it is clear that the people themselves are creating their own outcome. But I'll say more about that in the future videos. Hope you found this interesting so far, and I'll get the next video up as soon as possible and we can move on to the next stage. Thanks very much for watching. Goodbye.